Okay, so this is our fourth entry in the feedback webinar series, all about why you need to move away from classic SharePoint. If you're a SharePoint user of some experience, you'll probably be aware of what classic SharePoint is. But if you're joining this webinar with a kind of question about what's classic and what's modern, we'll explain the origin of classic and why it's still around and why you need to start thinking about perhaps moving away from it if you're already using classic and still continue to do so. A little bit about myself just before we get started. I won't spend too much time talking about myself because if you're familiar with the series, you probably heard from myself a few times. But my name's Chris, and I'm the Technical Content and Training Lead Manager at Combined Knowledge. I get myself involved in community events, conferences, webinars, and my sort of day-to-day role is managing a training team and creating content for our support solutions and actually being out on the road and teaching people face-to-face about Office 365. I also get involved with the Microsoft Step-by-Step book series, so I've been involved with the SharePoint Step-by-Step 2013-2016 books, which I thought I'd mention because, of course, it's relevant to this webinar that we're discussing right now. So hopefully I'll be able to answer all of our questions in and around SharePoint as we're going through the session today, but anything I can't answer, I'll obviously kind of get your contact information from our attendees list, hopefully get back in touch with you afterwards with any answers I can't manage. Just a little bit about the events coming up. If you're interested in attending a user adoption seminar, there's a fantastic one that's going to take place in London this month around building a sustainable Office 365 adoption program, the art of the possible. This is free to register. It's on November the 14th and it's based in London at Glaziers Hall. If you're interested in evolving your workplace to utilize Office 365, but you're not too sure on how to approach it, it may be a good webinar for you. It basically evolves the story from start to finish in regards to how you can potentially implement Office 365 in the workplace, but having that sustained outcome, not just having a big bang and a fizzle out, giving the opportunity to continually improve and deploy Office 365 services and keep that momentum going. So if you have a quick look on our Combined Knowledge website at events, you'll find information about that. But I can also put the link for this into the chat panel as well, and that will just give you the information that you need in regards to the content for the event. Okay, so here we go. So if you are interested in that, I'll just pop that into the chat area just briefly, and then you can collect that hyperlink directly from the chat interface. If you are attending this session, well, not attending, but if you're watching this session through YouTube, you can always pause the video and have a quick look at the user interface at the top of the screen there. Okay, I'll just close that down now and let's move on. So the next part of the seminar is going to focus on what classic SharePoint is. So I'm going to sort of tell you the story of SharePoint, so to speak, and then we're going to kind of inform you as to what the modern kind of overlay is for SharePoint and what benefits that brings you. Okay, so I'll just wait until my system updates. Got a little hyperlink that's embedded into this slide and I've accidentally clicked on it and now it's trying to load that web page again. So hopefully once it's recovered I can move on to my next slide and we can continue talking. Okay, there's only so much patience I have for these things, so let's just cancel that and we can hopefully move on. Oh no. We will get there eventually. Like I say, it's not a session without any technical difficulties, so we'll get back on track with that in just a second. Here we go. So here we are. So why you need to move away from classic SharePoint? First of all, what is classic SharePoint? For those of you who kind of recognize the user interface from this particular slide, this is what classic SharePoint looks like. It's basically something that's derived some of its look and feel from the original Microsoft Office products. Scaling back to 2007, Microsoft introduced the ribbon navigation across the top of the screen, Rather than having many drop-down menus that can tend to hide interface selections like buttons and options, we kind of broke away from those drop-down menus and created bright, rich buttons that were collected into contextual and relevant tabs. SharePoint didn't adopt this in 2007. It actually adopted this look and feel in 2010. From that point, it gave us the opportunity to use a consistent interface from Microsoft Office right into Microsoft SharePoint. So that's what classic SharePoint looks like. You can see that the interface is quite busy, but that's kind of what we're talking about today on the session. Where does that interface come from? As we mentioned, back in 2007, Microsoft Office introduced the ribbon interface, which was eventually adopted in SharePoint 2010. But the classic interface stretches all the way back to 2001 when SharePoint originated. That interface has been evolving over many iterations of the SharePoint product on premises, which refers to IT departments setting up servers to provide the SharePoint service to businesses to act as an enterprise content management system. At some point in kind of past 2010, Microsoft introduced Office 365, which kind of span a tapestry of new services that rotated around SharePoint, acting as the content management system still. What effectively happened is from 2010, Microsoft started to sort of introduce SharePoint Online, and eventually a more modern interface evolved, which is what eventually was pushed into sort of 2013. So effectively, you could upgrade your SharePoint Online infrastructure to look like SharePoint 2013 eventually. Then as Microsoft pushed on with SharePoint Online, then changes kind of started happening in the cloud rather than on premises, and feature packs were deployed to make the user interface and features still to maintain alignment with that which was in SharePoint Online. Now it's got to the point where the roles are completely reversed. In SharePoint Online, we've got this sort of modern interface that's sort of taken hold, which is now being projected back into SharePoint 2019. So we've got this point where SharePoint was originally moved by the on-premises products, but now the on-premises products are deriving their aesthetics and features from SharePoint Online. But if we're talking about where Classic comes from, effectively, most of the look and feel of Classic comes from 2016 right back to the past. The interesting thing is, it's not true to say that a SharePoint site is not classic. In fact, it is classic underlying. Every team site that's created in SharePoint Online in Office 365 is effectively rooted into its classic look and feel. What you'll notice on this particular diagram is that certain interfaces like site contents, recycle bins, search, and modern lists and libraries actually have a parallel classic interface that's been evolved into a modern look and feel. We bounce between modern SharePoint site pages, site contents menus, modern lists and libraries, recycle bin, and search, almost just about seeing all of the modern look and feel. But really in the background, you can switch back to the classic look and feel, as well as certain apps that have never been updated to look modern. In fact, certain interfaces like the Site Settings menu and the List and Library Settings menu for your SharePoint sites do not have a modern look and feel. Therefore, you're forced to look at the classic user interface. This is something that the owners of SharePoint sites will often see because they often go into the settings menus to configure. However, most end users will not dwell in these menus, so they don't really get the opportunity to see the classic side of SharePoint, but it is in reality still there. If you want to have a look at classic SharePoint and you're forced by your organization to use modern, you can still switch back by using the button at the bottom of the quick launch. That button switches you to classic, and then you can use the exit classic experience button in the quick launch again to switch back. Let's have a quick look. Going back to my previous slide, let's talk about maybe the recycle bin and the site contents menu. So if I go across to our SharePoint site, you'll notice we've got our site contents link over here. And when I navigate across to this particular site, you'll notice that we've got the option to return to classic SharePoint at the bottom left. By clicking on that option, the page will refresh and we'll be having a look at classic SharePoint in the site contents menu. One of the things that's slightly distressing about this is that the quick launch down the left-hand side yields additional options. So you'll notice that we've got a recent heading with the 5 most recent apps that have been added to our SharePoint site. So there's somewhat inconsistencies here. In addition to that, we can also edit the top link bar, which we weren't able to do in modern mode. So there's buttons in this interface that we don't get in modern. And we can see large tiles that allow us to manage apps in our current site. If we navigate over to the recycle bin by using the quick launch, the buttons still work, and you'll notice we're looking at a classic recycle bin. Now this is harder to kind of tell that it's classic, but I can still see the original quick launch on the left side of the screen. If I choose exit classic experience at the bottom left of the screen, you'll notice that we'll switch back to modern mode, where we have the tidier quick launch, we don't have the edit button for the top link bar, and the look and feel is slightly more modern. One of the advantages of the modern look and feel is that it's flexible. It has a responsive design, which means as you squash and pull the web browser, the content will fold up and picture nicely within the frame. The idea behind this is that these websites are designed for mobile devices. No matter what size screen you use this content on, it should always work, providing the full navigation and experience in a narrower screen. The classic SharePoint doesn't do this. As an example, if we navigate to a document library, and then switch to our classic mode, and then try and sort of restrict the user interface. So you can see that I've got all of my options from classic at the moment. If I try and restrict the user interface, we end up with this large scroll bar, which is not particularly ideal. And a lot of the menus have compacted themselves into smaller user interfaces. So that's not exactly a great user experience. Learn to live with it kind of thing. But actually, that does hamper user adoption. So we do want to make sure that our end users are having a clear, consistent experience on all their devices. So having a responsive design is quite important. So let me give you my perspective on SharePoint Classic and SharePoint Modern. As you can see from the user interface in front of you, there are at least about 20 buttons simply in the Files tab for Classic SharePoint. If I were to click on the Library tab, I'll be presented with up to about 30 buttons of options that are available to manage a SharePoint library as well. That's also present in the mini menu just over here, and we've also got the right-click and ellipsis menu and the call-out card menus in SharePoint as well. There's lots that SharePoint can do, but projecting all of that to an end user can sometimes cause overcomplication, and they feel like the system is too difficult to digest. So look at what you can see in front of you, and then take a second to look at the next interface. This is SharePoint Modern. As we discussed earlier, it's tidier, it has a responsive design, and more care and consideration has been placed into this user interface to support end users. At the top of the screen, you can see several buttons. They're smaller, don't take up as much space, and simply labeled. You can see on the user experience over here that it's nice and tidy as well, even with right-click enablement to allow us to open up menu systems in a more natural way as you would in File Explorer. Key interest has been placed in being able to resize columns, quickly add columns without having to branch into other user interfaces, and even the ability to pin documents to the top and quickly preview documents with being able having the additional option to add metadata if required. So the general user interface has been tidied up, refined, and made a lot simpler. These changes have made it easier for people to adopt something like SharePoint within the organization, so it takes less time for me as a trainer and an instructor to sort of teach students about things like modern SharePoint. It also means that effectively, because there's fewer options, people are finding it a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more easy to sort of utilize SharePoint. So they're growing in confidence in using SharePoint. And also things like lesser used features like RSS feeds tend to sort of be hidden from the modern user interface. These lesser used features are still in the classic interface. Remember, you can switch back to SharePoint Classic if you want to. But effectively, like I say, Microsoft are trying to tidy up the menu system, make it a little bit easier for us to use. So effectively, we've already mentioned that we've said that SharePoint Modern works better on mobile devices because it has a responsive design. So that means that not only is it faster to adopt within the organization, but across mobile devices as well. So I've got my little classic dinosaur on a rocket ship here. And not to say that SharePoint Classic is that old and SharePoint Modern is too revolutionary, but this is a kind of evolution. But one thing I wanted to say is that quite often I've sort of thought about SharePoint and thought, you know what? SharePoint used to have really cool things like really good task lists and calendars and surveys and workflows, but I kind of feel like they've been left behind. Microsoft have not created modern ways of working with any of these components. You can still add the old workflows, you can still add the old surveys, but things like the surveys in SharePoint haven't been updated since 2007, and I've always wondered, why haven't they done this? Well, the answer was in Office 365, Microsoft don't really want us to rely on those services anymore. The reason that we need to move away from classic into modern is that the modern world of SharePoint is not just SharePoint. It's also Flow, it's Forms, it's Events web parts, it's Planner. It's using these more capable systems to replace things that we used as classic users. So let me show you a world of classic and modern and try and sell it to yourself as to what solution you think provides more benefit to you and your colleagues. Let's start with workflow, certainly something that I spend a lot of time building. So effectively, one thing that we have are different tools that are kind of getting too dated for working with workflows. Things like SharePoint Designer and InfoPath for building forms are quite dated in regards to customizing SharePoint. In fact, Microsoft have advised that after 2026 that there's no further support for these solutions. We do have Visual Studio for creating solutions, but you'd need to be a developer to be able to build those particular components. We do have out-of-the-box workflows, but as we'll discover, that is still somewhat a dated interface. Let me show you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our policies libraries here, and I've created two policies libraries, one with classic workflow and one with one I potentially want to update with Microsoft Flow. So here's a classic SharePoint list. Now, first of all, if you're using SharePoint Online in the cloud, workflows are disabled by default. You'd need to go to your settings cog at the top right of the screen, go to your site permissions, and go to your, not site permissions, what am I doing? Site information, and view all site settings. From here, we can go into site collection features, and as you can see at the bottom, we've got our workflows feature. So as a site owner in Office 365, you're normally a site collection administrator as well, based on Microsoft's Office 365 group. So you'd be able to enable this, but it is disabled by default. What enabling the workflow feature does at the site collection features level is it allows you to add workflows directly to your SharePoint lists and libraries, but they are classic workflows. And if you've used classic workflows before, there's not a lot of scope to customize them. You could basically choose a template and from that template choose an audience, but you're kind of on the rails in the way it works. So a classic SharePoint workflow can be added to a modern SharePoint library by clicking on the settings cog and going to the library settings, going into workflow settings, and you would then choose the option add a workflow. However, I've already created a workflow called sign-off policy, and this will show you a little bit of what the workflow looks like. So this workflow is very, very simple. Like I say, it's based on the old workflow system, so it's just a simple approval workflow called sign-off policy. And on the next screen, you'll see that this workflow just assigns a task to myself and gives me a couple of days to work on it. No customization, no referencing, nothing particularly clever. So I'll come out of that and let's give the workflow a little bit of a test. So if I go back to my SharePoint library, you'll notice that I'm having to sort of dash between modern and classic, and it's not particularly convenient. That's one of the problems that we have with classic and modern, the user interface changes. You'll see that I've got a workflow that's currently in progress. So this workflow was started by using the built-in workflow button. So if we go to more, we've got our workflow button there for starting the workflow, and we've got one that's in progress. If I go to my mailbox, we should be able to see the workflow that started. But one of the problems with these classic workflows is that the integration to approve or reject the task used to be in the email. However, if we have a look for the original task assignment, you'll notice that I have to actually navigate to the document or to the SharePoint site to approve or reject. So the integration doesn't seem to work very well in the web version of Outlook. So that's a bit of a problem. So what I'd have to do is I'd almost have to click on the stamp here And you'll see a sort of classic Visio web service, and then I've got the task here. This isn't particularly very modern. I have to kind of go into the interface and then approve the task. So when it comes to classic workflows, they're kind of getting to the point where they are being left in the past. The user interface in Outlook is not allowing me to approve or reject the tasks very effectively. This Visio web service is taking ages to load, the page is kind of churning, but I can still approve the task, but I have to go into SharePoint. I have to follow the links back to SharePoint to do it. So this doesn't feel very slick to me. It's certainly something that I'd say is very classic, and it doesn't really gel with the modern interface. So one of the ways that we could potentially remedy that is to roll around and try and use something slightly different. So going back to my slide, we could potentially implement something more modern. So like I say, the value of SharePoint Modern is that it's highly integrated into other line of business services like Microsoft Flow. So Flow comes as part of most people's Office 365 license, and it's used to automate business processes. So if you wanted a workflow for a simple task process, well, Flow's got you covered. One of the things I like quite a lot about the new SharePoint flows are that they're well integrated into SharePoint and take very little effort to set up. The workflow that I just built in Classic is not particularly very easy to use, but watch what I'm going to do here. Same style of document library, couple of documents, and I'd like to have these documents signed off. So one of the things that I'm going to do is just click on the ellipsis here, and I've got Flow. And you'll notice that after a second, it recognized that we're in a document library, and we could potentially request a sign off of this document here. If I choose request sign off, Microsoft talks to Flow and starts the integration process for building yourself a new business process. Eventually. Hopefully that won't take too long. We'll let it buy its time. So this is the standard request sign off. Basically, it's a manually triggered workflow in SharePoint that assigns an approval or task to a specific individual. Choose to create flow. Give that a few seconds to just add the workflow to the SharePoint library. So first of all, I haven't had to really build anything, which is quite good. So for end users that, they're trying to adopt SharePoint, they're not particularly big workflow solution builders, they just want to have their documents signed off, they could just place this workflow directly in their library. Now, if I cancel this for a second, let me just show you what happens now. So I'm an end user, I want to sign this document off. So go to Flow, Request Sign Off, and you'll notice that the workflow is now being added to the SharePoint library, so I can actually assign a task to a particular person, maybe my manager, to sign the document off, provide some comments, and send that across to my manager. Again, I'm slightly regretting closing that window to prove the point of going back into the user interface, but hopefully, again, there we go. Oh, it's going to ask me to add it again. Technically, I didn't start it, so it didn't finish the process, but we'll just let that roll through. Okay, so who will approve this? I'm going to pass this one to Simon. And message, can you sign off my request? Okay. So effectively, it says it started the workflow. It says the sign off status is now pending. And then when Simon goes in and approves or rejects, that will be updated here. We could also navigate to the Microsoft Flow app to keep track of it as well if we wanted to. So that's a quick way that we could potentially get the same degree of success, but with an interface that remains modern, that doesn't jump us into classic interfaces, and is actually much more up to date. For example, Microsoft Flow has much better email integration, allowing you to potentially answer the response for the approval request directly from the email. Now, moving away from workflows and talking about those surveys in SharePoint was something that I used a lot. SharePoint Classic surveys are great, but my goodness, have they been left in the past. Let's have a quick look. If I go and open my quizzes section, I've got this classic survey. Now, one thing I want to kind of show you about this survey is that this doesn't even have the ribbon from other lists and libraries. It has drop-down menus from SharePoint 2007. So this is basically about 12 years old now, this SharePoint list, but it's still pretty cool. You can effectively click on respond to my survey and have a little bit of a play. So this is a team feedback survey. This is classic SharePoint. Give that a few seconds. Again, seems to be the theme of this webinar. And this is a little Likert scale that I've set up. So how would you rate your knowledge of the following Office 365 apps? I'd say SharePoint, Forms, Teams, OneDrive, Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. There we go. Click next. Again, come on. When was the last time you received training? Say over a year ago. And this has a branching logic to the question. Sometimes if someone answers a specific question with a specific result, you can actually force the next question to be different. So that's something that I injected into this particular survey. So I've just completed my survey, but these kind of surveys require a lot of setup. So you have to make sure the security is correct. You have to make sure you distribute the links to these surveys. They're not particularly very efficient, but they serve a purpose. But quite quickly, things like SurveyMonkey took over as the de facto way of having surveys created and completed within departments. So to pull that back, Microsoft have implemented Microsoft Forms. I've got a little example of a Microsoft form that I have over here. So I'll just open that in a new tab. And this is an example of a feedback form that I actually designed in a previous webinar. If you want to learn more about Microsoft Forms, I've got a previous Forms webinar in the feedback series that you're more than welcome to watch. But the way that this works is, because this form's a better solution than the classic SharePoint surveys and it's modern and has a responsive design, what we could effectively do is implement it on a web page. So what I have here is I have a SharePoint web page that I've put into my left navigation known as the Quick Launch. And on that page, I've basically just left the page blank. And if I click on Edit, on a SharePoint web page, I can start to integrate my form. I just choose Add a Web Part, go to Forms, and I'm going to add an existing form. And it asks for my web address, which was the reason why I kind of decided to open the form earlier and just kind of show you that. So it's given me two options. I've got the option to collect responses or show form results. So you'll notice here that I've actually got my sort of responses here for this survey. And I've got my questions as well. So you can either show the questionnaire to fill out or the responses. I think I might have got the wrong URL there, so let's just get the correct URL. Hopefully that will work. It should work. There we are. It's loading now. So I could show it as results or to collect the responses, whichever you think would be more useful, or both. You could add two web parts showing both the information. And I'll just save that page. So in a very short amount of time, I've still got a very interactive survey. It's modern. It will kind of collapse to the size of the page quite nicely. So it's certainly a much more up-to-date way of providing your survey responses. So again, we're kind of moving away from Classic by adopting another service and bringing it into SharePoint to act as a form replacement. The same is true for calendars. If you used calendars in SharePoint, little trick for you, there's a new web part that actually leverages calendars in SharePoint and provides a much more modern user interface for working with that content. If you've used classic calendars, they look a little bit like this. So here's my calendar for our team events over in November. Classic calendars look a lot like Outlook. In fact, they do have a level of integration with Outlook where you can connect them up. But again, we might want to do something a little bit more modern. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our, let's go back to our modern user interface. again, as you can see, by even just having classic apps, it keeps sort of bouncing me between these two interfaces. So where possible, I'd want to kind of focus on modern to stop that from happening. So I'm going to go to this web page that I've set up here. And again, it's just similar to my forms demonstration earlier. All I did was I created a new page, gave it a name, gave it a lovely header at the top of the screen. And then I'm going to edit that page. And then I'm going to add a web part. And I'm going to search for the events web part. When you add the events web part, you'll notice that you can also configure it, so you can edit the settings for the web part and choose the way that the calendar displays, how many events to display. We could call this team calendar, something like that. And if I actually just sort of save this page, we are able to engage with the content immediately. So you'll notice that we've got a few sort of events that are popping up here. And I could choose to add an event. And I'll call this event drinks. And I think that'll do. So you'll notice that the form for inputting a event into your calendar is modern. So it's got that responsive design. It's actually got the ability to do geography, so geographical locations. You've got your banners at the top. You can make it very pretty. But one thing I just want to sort of highlight here is that this is actually an old dog with a new trick. SharePoint still uses a classic calendar to store all of the events. It just attaches your web part directly to the calendar in the background. So if I actually go back to my site contents menu, and scroll down, you'll notice that I've got team events, which was last modified at 3:40. And if I click into that, it's actually leveraged an existing calendar in my SharePoint list. There's my 4 p.m. drinks. So if you don't have an existing calendar, it will create one for you called events. So if you don't have any SharePoint Classic calendars, it will create one called events. If you do have a calendar, it could leverage that, but you could also go into the configuration and change it if you want to. But the truth is that, again, it's still using a classic calendar in the background. So I've kind of cheated there, where I say, oh, we need to move away from classic. Well, by design, Microsoft has just got a classic overlay, a classic background, the SharePoint list, but the modern web parts link back to it. So it's still using it to store the data. But I call it a win. I still think it's, again, a more modern user interface for the SharePoint system. And then lastly, the other thing I wanted to mention is Planner. So if you have used classic SharePoint task lists before, they look a little bit like this. So let's see if I can drum up an example. If you don't click again, and hopefully it will load a little bit faster. No such luck. Come on. Okay, so we've got our tasks sections here, and I've got a classic tasks list and tasks with Planner. So what I might do is I might open these in tabs. Hopefully that will help with the load time. Right, so our classic task lists looks a little bit like this. I've set this one up to be quite pretty, but it took a little bit of work to do. So task lists have this sort of timeline web part at the top of the page, and that timeline web part allows you to pin tasks directly to the timeline. It has a level of interaction as well, so you can sort of move and color code things. So it's quite pretty. But again, it's classic, so there's a lot of buttons to contest with, and effectively it just is still quite functional, but it doesn't send notifications or keep people informed or give people access to these tasks to complete. It's all still quite very much a table in the background. Whereas if we wanted to really evolve and use modern functionality with our SharePoint lists, SharePoint sites, we could potentially replace it with a web part that links to Planner. So Planner is a task management system. It gives us the opportunity what's it doing? Let's go into all, see what's going on. That's odd. My planner web part doesn't seem to be present. Let me just save and try that again. Yeah, it's there. You saw it. I've got this recorded. So it did originally say that the planner web part wasn't there, and now it's actually decided to buckle and place it in. Now, one of the things that this SharePoint has behind the scenes is an Office 365 group, and an Office 365 group has a planner associated to it. You'll see in my left navigation here that if I open up my planner in a new tab, this is actually the planner that's associated with my Office 365 group and thus my SharePoint site. So planner just gives me that opportunity to sort of bring together various tasks and organize them and assign them to colleagues. It's got charts and other components to help me track their processes, and there's a corresponding mobile app for mobile users to receive updates around their tasks. I can add this directly in to my web part and choose to display all of our charts, the board, or other components that might be useful for my end users. Again, we're trying to leverage modern technology, but we know that Microsoft aren't developing any of this classic stuff, so we have to look at where we can bring the modern functionality into a modern SharePoint site. But you can see there that we can interact with our tasks directly from this page. By the way, if you don't like the fact that this banner is taking up a lot of space at the top of the page, you may already be aware, you may not, but you can edit that banner and go for a plain banner, and that will actually just save you a little bit of space at the top of the page if you're worried that people aren't going to see the content hanging off the bottom there. So that just helps you a little bit there. Okay, so let's go back to my slides. So I just wanted to kind of summarize there, and I do think that hopefully you'll agree that Microsoft once announced a few years ago that they were going to turn off Classic for Office 365 users, and there was an uproar from the community, and I was one of them, to be fair, just around the fact that it's like, you know, some people are still using Classic, especially people who brand. People who are branding SharePoint rely on Classic SharePoint because there's not really an effective way of branding modern SharePoint. I again stuck to my guns, but then I started seeing all of these modern apps integrating with modern SharePoint. And I slowly started to say, well, they created Planner, but why won't they update, you know, the task lists in SharePoint? They've created forms, but what if they left surveys for 2007? And you know, why don't we have a much better workflow designer in SharePoint? But the truth is, they do have these components. Microsoft designed them to work not just with SharePoint, but other line of business systems around Office 365 and outside of Office 365 as well. In the context of Flow, it's a workflow designer for not just Microsoft tools, but also tools outside of the organization as well. So when you actually start to think, actually, this is a bigger world than just SharePoint, and modern SharePoint is the key to integrating these solutions into your modern workspace, then actually I started to release my grip of Classic. I started to believe that actually, you know what, there's never going to be a better task list in SharePoint. We're going to have to use that Planner tool. And Planner will evolve, Planner will get better, and it brings that luxury as well as Flow and the events web parts and all of those components I've been discussing. It brings all of those luxuries directly into SharePoint. This is why we need to kind of look towards the future rather than stick our heads into the past. The legacy interfaces are never really going to be invested in. They're never really going to get better. We have to kind of go with these future technologies. Now, you might advise that, you know, we just don't know how they work. That's fine. Combined knowledge, we're more than happy to sort of show you the ropes in regards to your SharePoint needs. You might have a few business champions that you want to skill up in SharePoint. Maybe you've got some IT specialists that you want to sort of roll out training to, or maybe you've got a train the trainer scenario where you want to sort of skill up your internal training team. Combined Knowledge have a 4-day SharePoint hands-on class that you can attend, delivered by our knowledgeable experts at Combined Knowledge that can give you all the knowledge you need to make a success of your SharePoint online system and understand all of the intricacies and all of the benefits it offers to you. If you're more interested in seeing how those tools work together, not just SharePoint, but how Teams works with SharePoint, how Forms and Planner and Delve and Sway can all integrate together, you might like our new Office 365 Power User course. This is a 3-day hands-on course that gives you the opportunity to learn about all of the tools in Office 365 to give you a good basis on how those tools work, what to use and when, and how to bring them all together. If you're interested in that, I'll provide the sales contact information very shortly at the end of the seminar today. You can contact us if you would like a private delivery at your office, or check out the Combined Knowledge website if you're interested in one of the publicly scheduled courses. In addition to sustainability, one of the things that will be discussed in the November the 14th event that I mentioned right at the beginning of the seminar on building a sustainable Office 365 adoption process, one of the things that we want to highlight at Combined Knowledge is our Training Plus solution. Training Plus gives you access to on-demand training content around all of the apps in Office 365. One of the things that we wanted to highlight to you now is that you can use the new solution Direct Links, which comes as part of Office 365, to build your own user interfaces with our training content. You can also rebrand your content dynamically so it looks like your own organization's content. A quick little example as to how that might look. I'm going to show you a quick little preview of how that might look in your organization. So normally we access our Training Plus solution directly from the app launcher, so you can launch all of our training content directly from here. But some organizations, they might want to do things slightly differently. They might want to create a new starter page, which gives training videos that every new starter must go through to learn more about the Office 365 solutions that they kind of be using. So I'll show you a little example of this. So direct links are just URLs, and if you're subscribing to Training Plus, you can embed those URLs in things like Microsoft Teams or Microsoft SharePoint. This is a little example of a sort of branded experience that we've set up for an organization. You can see from this that we've got a standard SharePoint page. You place the direct links in directly to our Office 365 content. And then you can sort of build a sort of step-by-step process for people to work their own way through that accesses the entire wealth of the Training Plus content. Again, it can be branded as well. So a couple of examples down here. We can make sure that the content looks as much like your organization as possible, and then you can embed it directly into your SharePoint pages and team sites to provide on-demand training in a structure that works for your organization. So again, if you are interested in Training Plus, if you want to see a demonstration as to the benefit that Training Plus can bring to your organization, do contact us at sales@combined-knowledge.com. And if you want any sort of SharePoint training or Office 365 training, again, you can contact the sales@combined-knowledge, and our team will get back to you with any answers to the questions that you pose. So we're just sort of coming up to the end of our hour, but I just wanted to kind of talk to you about what we'll be bringing to you in our upcoming sessions. So we're going to be running another webinar soon around Power Apps by popular demand. And by popular demand, I mean a landslide of people saying, could you do a kind of a practical build an app webinar where you can just show us from start to finish, beginning with nothing and ending up with a really powerful app, something that you might see in a marketplace. So I'm up for the challenge. I'll quite happily show you Power Apps to the end of the earth. Keep an eye out for our next webinar. It's going to be around Power Apps. So if you haven't really utilized Power Apps much yet and you want to kind of get an idea of what it could be used for, join in for that webinar. We'll be providing dates and information about that hopefully very shortly. Again, I've put contact information for our sales team up there as well. So if you're interested in Training Plus or training, do get in contact with us. We'll be more than happy to speak to you about your requirements. And thank you for those who stuck around until the end of the webinar. For those who stick around for the CK webinars, know that the true patriots are the ones that are rewarded, that stay around until the end. So there is a £50 voucher that's available and up for grabs. So one thing I wanted to do, if you could go into the questions area and do #SharePoint. I can see Helen's already done it from Fujitsu, so thank you very much for that. So yeah, #SharePoint in the questions menu. If you do that and your email address, Corresponding with that, I will then go through all of the people who have done that hashtag SharePoint that have been there till the end, and we'll just do a generated who's won, and then I'll get our delightful sales team to send you your Amazon voucher right at the end of the session. So one of you will win, and trust me, it's not going to be me. For those who have asked any questions, I just noticed Michelle just mentioned she's got a drop-off library question. Certainly. I'm going to go through the questions shortly, but for those who are watching on YouTube, we normally cut the questions off because they can go on for quite a duration of time. So for our video watchers, thank you for tuning in for this webinar. Hopefully see you in the next one. For those who have attended in person, thank you so much for your time and attention on today's webinar. Hopefully it's been useful, and you can hopefully see that there are good reasons to move away from SharePoint Classic, and there are great things on the horizon. So yes, it's an adoption challenge. Combined Knowledge can help you with that. Let us know how we can help you. Until then, thanks for joining in for the webinar today, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.